In this lecture, we're going to learn all about Shader Graph in Unity. This is a very powerful tool that lets you easily make some really cool shaders by dragging and dropping various nodes and simply connecting dots. It's an entirely visual tool, there's no need to write any shader code, so it's super simple to use. Okay, so first of all, in order to use Shader Graph, you need to be using one of the SRP render pipelines. So that's the high definition render pipeline or the universal render pipeline. The Shader Graph does not work on the old built-in render pipeline. But if you absolutely need to use the built-in render pipeline and you want a visual shader authoring tool, then I can recommend the Amplify Shader Editor from the Asset Store. I've used it previously when I needed to make some shaders for the built-in render pipeline. It's also a visual authoring tool and it works great. But you're probably using URP or AGRP, so Shader Graph is the official Unity tool that you can use. Now, I covered render pipelines in another lecture, so if you don't know what they are, go ahead and watch that. In there I cover how to install and use them. Here in this project, I'm using the universal render pipeline, so we can start playing around with Shader Graph. To do that, just right-click on your project files, go into Create, over here into Shader, and now the options that you see here will differ slightly depending on whether you're using URP or AGRP. So in my case, I've got the universal render pipeline, and then I've got all of the various shader graphs. Now again, since I'm using URP, the sprite-like shaders, they are specific to the 2D render. But again, everything is mostly the same, either in URP or AGRP. Okay, so for the type of the graph, let's just go with lit, which is the most basic thing. Then call it testing shader graph. And then just double click, and it automatically opens the shader graph window. Now when working in shader graph, in order to get a bit more space, you can maximize this window. And here's a quick Unity tip. If you press down Shift Space, you automatically set it to windowed or full screen. All right, now in here, the first thing we see are these two nodes. So these are essentially the master nodes, so our output. You've got the vertex data and the fragment data. And then over here on the top right corner, we see the graph inspector. If you don't see it, there's a button right here. Here you see a bunch of graph settings, like for example, making it lit or unlit, setting the workflow to metallic or specular, making the surface opaque or transparent, and so on. Then another useful thing is down here, we've got the main preview, and you can click and drag in order to increase the size. And you can also right-click in order to change the shape. So instead of a sphere, let's say go with a cube. All right, so there's our cube. And again, if you don't see this window down here, then up here you've got the button to toggle the main preview. Okay, so just like this, let's try out this completely empty shader. And to do that, it's very important to go up here and click on Save Asset. There you go, now it's saved. So now back in my scene view, let's just create a very simple cube. And now in order to use a shader, we need to be using a material. So let me create a new material. Name it my cube shader graph. And then here on the shader, you select from the drop-down menu. And in this case, go inside shader graph. And yep, here we've got the testing shader graph. All right, so we are now using our custom shader. Now just select the cube and apply the material. And there you go. Now this cube is being rendered using our custom shader. All right, awesome. Now having this very basic cube isn't really very interesting. So let's go back into shader graph. And up here on the top left corner, we see the blackboard or the properties window. Again, if you don't see it, there's a button right here. All right. So this is where we can add properties that our shader can use. So for that, let's click on the plus icon, and now shows up all of the various types that you can create. So one of the most basic ones that you'll be using quite often is over here, the texture 2D. So just a simple texture. So just like that, we add the property into our shader. And now each property also has lots of parameters. So if you click to select the property, then down here on the graph inspector, we can see all of the various property parameters. So here, first of all, we've got a name and a reference. Now the name for the primary texture is usually called the main text, and the reference is usually called underscore main text. So the reference name is the name that we're going to use if we want to modify shader properties through code, and normally as a convention, they start with an underscore. And also the name that you use through code has to match exactly what you write in here, so be careful with how this is case sensitive. All right, so with this we have our texture property. So let's just save and see what it looks like in the inspector. And yep, over here in the inspector we do see that we now have a field for the main text. So I can click and select something. All right, I've selected the texture, but nope, the cube still looks exactly the same. So there's no texture actually being applied. So let's go back into the shader. And here we want to actually use this texture. To do that, we can drag the texture property down here into our board. And now what we want is to apply this texture onto our master node. So we want to display the colors from this texture, so we need to connect the main texture over here into the base color. However, if we try to drag it directly, nope, it does not accept it. Here inside the parentheses, you can see the type for each input and output. So over here for the base color input, we see a 3, so that means 3 color channels, so RGB, red, green, and blue, but the texture is outputting a T2, which is a 2D texture. So in this case, that means that we need to sample the texture in order to convert from a texture into actual color values. So in order to add a node on board, we can simply right-click on empty space, go into Create Node, and now here we see a menu with all of the various nodes that are available. So in this case, we can go into Input, then down here into Texture, and then Sample Texture 2D. So double-click, and we add our Sample Texture 2D node. Or a quicker way to do this, let's just delete this one, and instead just press space and simply start typing, so Sample Texture 2D, and yep, just use it automatically. Alright, so we've got this node. As you can see up here on the inputs, we've got a T2 input, so just click and drag and connect that input. Then on the outputs, we can grab each individual channel, or we can grab the whole thing. So just grab the whole thing and connect it into the base color. Now this one actually has 4 channels, so it also has the alpha, but that one is ignored when it goes here, so it's not an issue. Alright, so just like this, we should be able to see our cube being printed with our current texture. So just hit on Save Asset. And yep, now we do see the cube being printed with our texture. Now, just one quick note here. As you can see, we set the main texture to something. And over here, while you're in Shader Graph, if you select the property, over here you can see a default texture. So you can click and select something from here. So there you go, just like that, you can easily see the preview to see what you're doing. But just keep in mind that this is just default. So what that means is that when you create a brand new material, so for example over here, and here's another quick tip, if you right click directly on the shader graph asset and you go into create and create the material, it automatically creates a material using that shader graph. So here on this one, when I create the brand new material, you can see that it automatically set the main texture to the default one. But on the one that I'm using on the cube, I already override it with a different texture, so that's the one that's being used. So just keep in mind that the most important is what you set on the material and not necessarily what you set over here on defaults. Alright, so just like this, we already have our most basic shader. We have a texture and we just render it on our surface. So pretty much every effect that you'd like to build is really just an extension upon this. Here inside Shader Graph, you can browse through all of these to see all of the tons and tons of nodes that you can add to make all kinds of logic. So as you can see, there's tons and tons of things that you can do. So beyond that, really, in order to be able to create any effect that you want, the main thing is to really start thinking in terms of colors and mathematical operations. So for example, let's say we want to make a simple tint into our texture. Now, if you've ever used any image program, you should be familiar with the basic multiply tint. We have an image and we tint everything with a certain color. So let's try to achieve that here. For that, let's create a new property. This one, let's name it a color. Let's keep the name as color, and again for the reference, let's set it to _color. And by default, let's say tint it into a green. And over here on the main texture, by default, let me just swap it out for the gray gradient. Alright, so here I've got my texture, and output out here I've got the various colors. So now let's hit space in order to add a multiply node. And now I can grab this color right here. And essentially we just want to multiply these two. So click, connect that one into that one, that one into that one. And if there you go, right here on the preview, we can already see the effect in action. So we've got this color in black and white, and we're multiplying it by a certain color. Again, you need to think about this in terms of colors and math. So what we're doing here is just imagine that this texture has a color value per each pixel. So every single pixel on this texture has a value for the red, green, blue, and alpha. And by multiplying, what we're doing is simply going through every single one of those pixels on every single one of those channels and multiplying all of them by this color. So since this one is in black and white, we end up with a pure color. Again, we're working with textures, but remember that in the end, it's really just all numbers. So just connect the output into the base color, and yep, now we've got our working shader. So down there on the main preview, we can see, yep, we've got our green cube. Now again, just save the shader. And back in the scene, now we can use any color in order to really change the color. So you can see just how easy it is to build upon this to make any effect you want. It's really all about placing nodes and just connecting the dots. Here in the properties, you can see all of the various types that you can add. So for another quick one, for example, let's add a float. So a simple float value. Let's call this saturation. Keep things nice and organized. So add the reference _saturation. And then let's add a saturation node. And here just input this one into that one. And for the input, let's put the color. So again, you can always move things around to get more space. So go into that one and you go out into that one. All right, so we added another property into our node. And now back in here, if I set the saturation to 1, then I've got the full color. And if I set it to 0, then we've got black and white. Another super useful thing when dealing with numbers is, for example, select. And over here on the mode, instead of default, let's go into slider. And let's say the minimum of 0, maximum of 1. So yep, now here on the material inspector, now instead of having to manually set the number, we can just use this nice slider. Go from 1 to 0 and so on. All right, now just one last thing, which is over here we're making a 3D shader. But as we saw, if we go into shader, in this case I'm using the universal render pipeline, so I also have the options for making sprite lit or unlit shaders. So let's just create one. And here it really works pretty much exactly the same way. There's only a handful of changes. So for example, over here we've got a sprite mask. And down here on the graph settings, we set it as sprite lit. And again, we can just add a simple texture 2D. Let's call it the main text. Again, set the reference to underscore main text. Let's choose a certain default and then just drag it in. And again, it's really the same thing. So just sample a texture 2D. We connect that one, connect the color into that one. And let's just swap out the preview. Instead of a sphere, let's make it a simple quad. And all right, all of that is working, but we also do see an issue. So this is a texture that has some transparency, but over here, nope, we're not seeing that. So if you want to handle transparency, remember that over here on the master nodes, you've got an input for the alpha. So in this case, we'll just connect the alpha directly from the texture. And yep, now we've got our perfect texture. So again, just hit on save. And back in here, let's create to the object. Let's go to sprites. All right, so over here, I've got my basic sprite. And on the sprite render, you also have a field for the material. So this is how you use custom shaders, even when working with flat sprites. So here, just right click on my shader in order to make a new material. Okay. And just apply it onto this one. All right, so it's applied. Now again, one interesting thing about the sprite render is that the sprite that you set in here, it gets automatically filled on the material on the main text property. So when doing this, changing the sprite in here doesn't actually do anything, doesn't change anything. So in order to modify the main text, it's up here changing the sprite just like with any other object. So there you go, just like that. And yep, I've got the sprite, it's got transparency and everything works great. Now one more thing related to shaders, which is you can modify them through code. So over here, I've got this very simple script. So on awake, it simply does a get component to grab the mesh renderer and grabs the material from that mesh renderer. And then on update, simply listening for a key down. And when I press the T key, it's going to go into the material and it's going to modify the color on the property that has the name exactly underscore color. And it's going to modify it into color.red. So as I press the button, I should be able to see the cube being tinted in red. All right, so here, as I press the button, and yep, there you go, it automatically changes into red. So I modify the shader property through code, which modified my material and modified the visual. So that's how easy it is to modify things through code. So you've got set color, then you've got all of the others. So set color array, set float, int, set texture, and so on. So with this, you can build just about anything in your shaders and control them in any way you want. So you can make shaders that are really simple or go crazy and really complex. The only limit is really just your own imagination. Alright, so now you know how to use Shader Graph in Unity in order to make some really awesome custom effects. This is a super useful tool that is really easy to use due to being very visual, and it enables you to create any effects you can think of.